So we'll be playing today a little bit in this circumstance response line. Now, my guest today is Mark Butler. Mark's a psychologist by training, and in terms of background, he's worked extensively in some really high-pressure corporate jobs, including general sales manager for global media companies. And when we were chatting prior to this, he said, you know, if you're working in Hollywood, if you're awake, you're working, basically. So it's pretty full on. And he's got a real interest in workplace mental health. That's the territory that he spends a lot of time in now, helping organisations to build genuinely proactive mental health responses and strategies, so that rather than being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff when it all breaks, we're actually doing something to fence the top of the cliff. A lot of his experience that informs that is out of really intense work. So working with veterans with post-traumatic stress, that's a fascinating area. You know, we're very good at as a community at setting people up to deal with crisis and response, not so good at detuning them afterwards. And also in the space of addiction and recovery programs, and another fascinating area where this stuff gets a real workout. So welcome, Mark. It's great to have you here.
Thanks very much, Mike. Delighted to be here. Yeah. And actually, you were just speaking to something, and it might have been before we started recording, when you were talking about the diagram behind your head there.
Yes.
How two people can have polar opposite responses to their environment or to a situation. And it reminded me of a lot of the research that happens in addiction. The most coveted research is into what they call monozygotic twins. So in other words, identical twins.
Yes.
How, you know, in every respect, they are carbon copies of each other, and yet one will succumb to an addictive process and the other one won't. You know, same family, same DNA, same environment, same upbringing, everything's the same. One will succumb to it and another one won't be affected by it at all. And I've worked with twins in that situation.
That's fascinating, isn't it?
It is absolutely fascinating. So we are creatures of our environment, aren't we? We very much we are.
Indeed. Yeah. So I spoke briefly as well about the survivor personality. This book, The Survivor Personality by Al Siebert, initially written about late 70s, probably one of the sort of pinnacle works in that space. There's a lot of other things since that have built on his research. He basically went looking for the people who survived against the odds. So, you know, when they were thrust into circumstances where their backs were against the wall and things were tight, they did better than the average. And he talks a lot in there about mindset, this sort of C piece. And I'd like to just read you a little segment out of this and then use it as a starting point for our conversation. So he's talking about stress here, something that if you're human, you've experienced a bit of. So whether a person experiences stress at work depends on the person's perception of what's going on and the person's coping skills. It's not about circumstance, it's your reaction to it that counts. What's stressful for one person is not stressful for another. He goes on a little bit and then he says, for these reasons, books, articles, workshops on job stress reduction are often more harmful than helpful, because they create the illusion that something called stress is out there, constantly assaulting and harming each of us. In truth, what most people call stress is really an internal feeling of strain that they don't like. A big part of this stuff, Mark, is around our ability as an individual to choose our mindset. To say, you know, well, if I want to be less stressed at one level, that is simply a decision to say I'm less stressed. I kind of like that thought in that it gives us a lot of agency, but I'm really cautious with it too, because it kind of puts all the responsibility on the individual. Yeah. And it'd be very easy for us to run to that classic Australianism, which is, you know, slip down to Bunnings and buy a bucket of concrete and harden up, which I really do not think is useful.
No, it isn't at all. Yeah.
Where do you think the line is in this between our personal agency and ability to choose and times and places where we need people and supports beyond ourselves to navigate our stress and pressure?
I would think the line is at overwhelm. And of course, as you said, look, it's different for everybody. So where one person feels overwhelmed is going to be a result of more than just the situation they're looking at. Yeah. So in my mind, stress, I don't see stress as a condition. And I come from a sort of clinical psychological background. Stress is a state of being. And like you say, it's, what's manageable for one isn't manageable for another. And in fact, what's manageable for me today might not be manageable for me tomorrow. So to use the analogy you used, the metaphor of, instead of being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff waiting for people to fall off and into the ambulance, if we can fence off the top of the cliff, we have a much better opportunity and a much better chance for a speedier sort of return to normality, whatever that looks like. And to me, that speaks to somebody's resilience. And traditionally, resilience is traditionally it's spoken about as our way of responding or reacting to stress. But in that prevention model, again, there's plenty that we can do to shore up our resilience and to get us into a mindset or a frame of mind, physically or mentally, where we're better able to cope. And it covers. In more recent time, people have started talking about health being an area that we can really focus on to build up our resilience. So and resilience in general, we're talking about, I guess, all the foundations of well-being, if you like. So there's our vision. Do we have decent sort of goals for life? Are we invested in our career? And by career, I mean like students studying, that's a career. People who are retired or are volunteering, or even doing their garden, that's the sort of a career, if you like. So if we have meaning and purpose, healthy, we see opportunity where there's adversity. These are all things that we can cultivate within ourselves. Mindfulness, meditating, that's another obvious sort of a one. Our level of tenacity or persistence is probably another one. And there's lots we can do in that space to structure our foundation, if you like, to set ourselves up to be the best version of ourselves we can. That's when we're in the place best positioned to deal with what we're calling stress in this scenario. Yeah. But there will be a time when we can't do it alone. And again, just talking back to, I guess, there's a great saying in the recovery rooms, like Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, or Narcotics Anonymous, NA. They have a great saying that says, "I can't, we can." And sometimes we're just not capable of surviving something ourselves. And we need to know that we can reach out and be accepted where we're at.
So this is a little bit of a side road, but I'm interested in your thoughts on, the way that we've, let's call it evolved for want of a better word, but the way that we've evolved our communities, we've got increasingly more and more individually oriented, less and less community oriented, certainly less and less cohabitated. How much of an impact do you think does that have on our capacity to collectively respond to somebody who's, reached that point of overwhelm and isn't coping on their own anymore?
Western society, I would say we're not very good at it. If you take a look at, the Western approach to sort of be the best you can be better than everybody in school, climb over people in a work environment, reach for that promotion and do whatever it takes to get ahead of everybody else. I think there's a cost to that. I think in, we'll say, Asian communities where there's 4 generations living together, supporting each other, because there isn't the level of sort of government support that we might enjoy, we'll say. There's a cost to that. I know inner city dwelling, the most recent research will say 50% of people living in inner cities are lonely. The levels of loneliness among young people, about 30% say that they're not. About a third would say that they are feeling lonely some of the time, and another third are saying they're lonely all the time.
Yeah, wow.
And that's relatively new. I mean, well, loneliness itself, stop me if I start wandering off in wrong directions here now, but loneliness itself as a concept is only a couple of 100 years old. Before that, when religion permeated everybody's lives a lot more than it does today, and I'm not sort of advocating religion by any means, but you weren't alone. You were alone with your God, whoever that was. Do you know what I mean? And there was a sort of sense of comfort in it. So the whole concept of being out there adrift, alone, and not connected or unsupported is moderately new in terms of our evolution. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought, and
isn't it interesting? Yeah.
It really is. It's triggering lots of lids that we could open and peer into. It, you know,
I've pulled a few threads here. Now we can go anywhere with this.
It's very good. It's one of the things I've loved about the conversations during this time is that, you know, we could dive into that for a day. The challenge is keeping it at 40 minutes. So it made me think a bit about work I used to do in the disability support space, working with families and people with disabilities. And one of the things there was that the better connected somebody was, the more of a personal network they had, the less was their risk of just about everything. So, you know, physical health conditions, mental health conditions, abuse, and pretty much any lens you look through.
Yeah.
So it's one of the challenges, isn't it? And I guess that's partly, I would imagine, at least, this is me speculating now, I would imagine that that's partly why we're seeing such a emergence of this as a workplace issue, and such an imperative for workplaces to address it, because for many, especially given some of those figures you've just quoted, work will be the most collective experience that they have of other human beings.
Yeah, very much, yeah. And again, Monash University just completed some research very recently, and their research is telling them that 1 in 3 people who will be returning to a workplace, either, you know, cyber returning or going back to work when their work resumes, 1 in 3 will be experiencing severe mental distress.
Wow,
it's a fairly big statement. I mean, there's 1, 2, 3, there's 8 of us, so nearly 3 of us on this chat here will be experiencing severe mental distress when we return. But and a lot of the time we speak to people and they say, oh yeah, no, I'm looking forward to going back to work. But it's actually, you know, I spoke to somebody yesterday and I said, so how have you coped during all this? She said, I was born for it. She's an introvert. She absolutely loved it. So she's in a great mental mindset frame, we'll say now, but she won't be when she has to go back to work, because there will be all the anxieties around, is my workplace safe? You know, is it safe to, you know, are we all gathering at the foot of the building waiting to get in the lift, and, you know, there's only 2 can get in the lift, and, you know, there's no coffee conversations because the canteen's going to be closed, and they've taken the water cooler out. So all the things that made me feel part of a connection or a family or community at work will be gone. Yeah. So we'll be working from home, but in the office, you know, and unable to sort of communicate to the same level. So I think, it's going to be tricky. It's going to be tricky.
That's a really interesting...
It's going to simmer.
Yeah, it's an interesting area, isn't it? Given particularly where Australia's placed now, with you know, a lot of workplaces going back and looking like the tail end of this week, rolling back to phase 3, I think they're calling it.
Yeah.
Which will take almost all the current limitations off, but certainly not all of them. What you're highlighting there really speaks to it's going to be a massive issue for workplaces. So I would imagine that the majority of workplaces are going to have their hands fairly full with core business, because there's been this time when business as usual has been difficult to do. So they'll be kind of spooling back up or back into, or addressing their work from that point of view. There's other organisations I'm aware of where they've actually they've been running flat out through this period, like it's actually been the busiest they've ever been.
Yeah,
which creates another whole set of issues.
Yeah, anyone in the field will tell you that. Yeah.
What do you think is if we were looking at organisations doing best practice, let's go for that. So if we were to be entering back into our congregated workforce, with absolute best practice around awareness of people of this roughly 30% that are coming back in with severe mental distress, and providing the kinds of supports that would, I guess, manage that well, what would that look like?
Well, there's going to have to be, I think, a seismic shift, because I think what's going to happen, if I was to, crystal ball it, I think what's going to happen is it will fall to HR to deal with it, or it'll fall to the employee assistance program, if the organisation indeed has one, and that's fraught with danger, because I think HR people are already stretched as far as they can be. They're trying to design the workplace so that it's safe. They're trying to implement new policy and procedures for how we do work. There's going to be new policies for how people can work from home, and where it's okay, where it's not, where we have to have people in the back of the workforce. And I think what's really going to be exposed is the ability of leaders, line managers, etc., to have a conversation if they need to. Right now, 70% of leaders and business owners will say that our organization is committed to a mentally or psychologically safe workplace. But about 30% of employees reckon that it's psychologically safe. And then when they talk about psychological safety in the workplace, usually what that refers to is that I feel safe enough to speak up in a meeting and put an idea out there, and it might be taken up or it might not, or I might try something and it might fail. And that's more around what we do. But for someone to be able to put their hand up and say, I'm not coping, the stigma that people feel around that, is this going to affect my career? Is this going to, will I even be heard? Or will I get the old, as you said earlier on, look, head down to Bunnings and get a teaspoon of Toughen Up, will you? There's a fear of that happening.
Yeah.
So I think best practice would be senior or line managers, anyone who's got some reports, would be feel comfortable or equipped enough to have a conversation that they right now might think that's a hard, challenging conversation. It actually isn't. It's a good conversation if you can have it. If your employee or one of your team puts their hand up and runs the risk of saying that they're not okay, and don't forget, now we're talking about 1 in 3, so there's somebody either side of me could put their hand up and say, I'm really struggling. If my response to them was, right, I let HR know, and then they'll get back to you when they've got time, and that person has just bared their soul and they're exposed. So I think what really needs to happen is I've worked with groups where you can teach empathy, you know what I mean? And I think we're predisposed to being in that place. We're pack animals, social animals. So we have, I think, for the most part, the ability, but it just needs to be brought out of somebody. So knowing what to look for, and then knowing what to say or do to support somebody in that space, I think is going to be key. And that's when you stop being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Because if you can spot that, you can get out in front of it before it becomes a far bigger issue than it needs, or than it can become.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so it'd be good to dive into a little bit of practical stuff, what people can do in terms of what to look for and what to say. But this really reminds me of a very tangible example of something where, you know, when we used to do 10-day survival courses, we'd get people literally to stop every 40 minutes and check for hotspots, which were blisters emerging. And people would go, we barely got started. Why would I be checking for blisters? And it's like, well, it's actually in that initial rub that it's easiest to treat. You know, if you let it actually turn into a blister, that's harder. And then if the blister pops and starts wearing away at your flesh underneath, that's even harder. And I remember a guy once, you know, he said to me, I could tell he had blisters. He was limping. And I said to him, look, pull your boots off. Let's do something about those blisters. And he said, no, if this was a real survival course, we wouldn't have all that first aid stuff with us. You know, if it was a real situation, we wouldn't have all that first aid stuff with us. I just want to tough it out and see if I can do it. Anyway, his feet were in bad shape by the end, and I rang him 2 weeks after the course just to see how he was going, and he was a bit sheepish. He said, I've literally just got out of hospital. And I said, oh, what were you in hospital for? And he said, one of my blisters got so bad, I ended up with an infection it was deep enough to get into his bone, and he was on IV antibiotics for 2 weeks. So I think there's some real parallels between what you're talking about in that situation, where action early, like it feels like we're impeding progress to sit down and take our boots off. It's like we've got distance to cover, we've got work to do, we've got outcomes to meet, we've got targets, deadlines, customers, budgets, you know, all of that endless to-do list.
Yeah.
And it feels
and in the recession and facing into a recession where, you know, it's going to double all of it for a less of a return. Yeah.
Yeah. And it feels counterproductive to stop literally or metaphorically and take your boots off. But in the longer play, it speeds things up immensely. You know, you're not dealing with these complex and challenging issues. So what kinds of things, you know, at the level of noticing someone limping and metaphorically taking the boots off, what kinds of things can we do as teammates or as leaders? What can we be noticing? What sort of conversations could we be having?
Look, I think what organizations across the board are doing right now, there's been in recent years public campaigns around mental health. I think New Zealand does it very, very well, with sports people speaking out and saying that they've got issues, and they even run ad campaigns on TV that kind of normalizes it a little bit. Particularly for the kids looking up to them. I think it's an excellent idea. We have something similar here in the Are You OK Day, which is great as long as you know what to do if somebody says, I'm not okay. You know what I mean? I mean, it's not enough to say, are you okay? And then just kind of go, oh, well, good luck with that. You know what I mean? Here's a balloon, or, you know, cupcake, or whatever it is they're doing. And like, the opposite end of that now is the best approach to that one is Woolworths, I believe, has announced, you know, hashtag Are You OK 365. Again, fantastic, as long as somebody reaches out and says, I'm not okay, that there is a strategy in place for them. So there's public campaigns we can do like that. There's evidence-based strategies. You know, mental health first aid training is another prime example that can happen in organizations, but quite often that takes 2 days of training, and it's a generic sort of program. I don't know. My experience is that it isn't sort of tailor-made or bespoke in any way. And that's a big ask for organizations to put people out to. Culture and leadership strategies, they exist, or diversity and inclusion is another one that's really big, but again, in larger organizations. But for my money, I think the best strategy that any business can take, and the beauty of this is, it's workable for large or small organizations, and it's actually the most cost effective. And that's what we call contact-based strategies. And by that, we talk about real conversations with real people around real issues. So that needs to come from the top down, right? So maybe your peer at best, but the business owner or the senior manager or the senior leader having a conversation around, yeah, I struggle with anxiety, or yes, I've had depression a number of times, or my partner or my kids is very, very anxious. If we hear people having conversations around it, it reduces the stigma, first of all, that, you know, we're going to be seen as less than, or we are the sum total of our mental health. And when you know the person that is putting their hand up and saying that they're struggling, um, and you know that they're more than the issue, and you know then that it's probably transitory, maybe short term, and you can deal with it because you know the person, you know what they're like. So it's a real story from a real person, you know. And don't forget, we're talking about, I mean, the stat we said a while ago about 1 in 3 will have severe mental distress coming back to the workplace. The number before that was actually 1 in 4, or in fact, it's about 30% of people this year in a work environment will experience a mental health condition.
Yeah,
half of us over our lifetime will. And if we say, you know, 30% of people will have a mental health issue of some degree, we do know that if it's not dealt with, half of those will develop a secondary condition. It's what we call comorbid. Veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, when it's not dealt with, will usually develop a substance use disorder, followed by depression and possibly anxiety. So they've got multiple. But if somebody is anxious for a considerable period of time and they don't do anything about it, just get more and more anxious, depression sets in because they get depressed from having chronic anxiety. Or they're presenting with depression. They're probably drinking a little bit too much, just trying to cope. So if the issue isn't addressed, that's what the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff looks like. 2 or more conditions. These things don't go away by themselves.
Yeah.
So we need to know that we can reach out to those people closest to us that can assist us or support us in getting better. And in the workspace, that's a line manager. Or if it is HR, it's HR. But we need to know that we won't be deemed to be less than. We won't be stigmatized for having reached out. That's the most important thing. And to know that the person we're speaking to knows what they're doing and knows what they can do to help us, what the ramifications are, and doesn't sort of pass it off. But that's really what and that's the most effective strategy, and it's the cheapest. You know, an organization with 10 employees can adopt that strategy. And I think it's KPMG or Deloitte, so one of the major international organizations. They have senior leaders in the company that have recorded videos of themselves talking about these issues, and they're up on the internet, and they say, give me a call if you want to have a chat. This is somebody anywhere in the business. So that's how you do it.
Yeah, that's great. There's another bit of an issue that I think sits alongside this that I'm not sure. Well, I certainly haven't heard it addressed. Is that what if you're one of the 1 in 3, and another of the 1 in 3 is coming to you for support? So particularly with leaders, I've spoken to a few that say, look, I'm struggling myself, but I obviously, you know, I don't want to unload that on my team. I don't want to burden people that are already stressed. That's part of the stigma piece, isn't it?
It is. And then that speaks to somebody's ability to be vulnerable. But in my book, that's actually not a bad scenario to be in, because to me that speaks to the Me Too campaign, which was you're not alone in this, and nor am I, and we can support each other through this program. There's a comment that's come up in the chat there that I haven't, from somebody. Support is good, but not sufficient. There is a better way. Change can drive inspiration and innovation, I guess. Yeah. Interesting point. Yeah.
So, Mark, I'm thinking that, you know, as organisations begin to head back to work, as whether we're people that own and run those things, or we're a line manager of some sort, or whether we're a part of the team.
Mm.
This is going to be something that we run into based on those figures. It'll be pretty much unavoidable. So, and it also strikes me that the best time to prepare for that would have been some time before, but we probably don't have that luxury.
No, that's always better. Yeah, hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Yeah.
That's it. I know you do quite a bit of work with organisations in this sort of space. If people wanted to get hold of you and talk more about this and responding to that particular issue as we come out of lockdown in their own organisation, whether that's a big one or a small one,
Sure.
what's the best way for them to get hold of you?
Email me would be an easy one. So it's mark@markbutler.com.au. My phone number is 0412 618 648. And I've got a website, markbutler.com.au. So you'll find me in there, any of those places, and I'm happy to have a chat to anybody. In fact, actually, if you jump on my website, there's one of those Calendly links, and just grab 15 or 30 minutes of my time for obligation-free chat. I'm very happy to.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. So
no, absolutely.
We'll include those links and phone numbers and what have you when we mail the recording of this out.
That'd be great.
So is there anything I'm aware that we've got lots of bits that, we could spend weeks, days, months, years probably diving into in a lot more detail.
We might need to do another one of these.
Possibly so. It'd be interesting, certainly as workplaces do start to head back and we start to see some of this impact actually rolling out. If you were to leave people with a couple of tips about, really tangible things that they could do, both at that individual level and at the more organisational level, what would they be?
From an individual perspective, I think focus on your resilience. Focus on a healthy mind and body. There's a very good. I'm a certified resilience coach, so I do a lot of that stuff as well. But here's a freebie tip: Dan Siegel, Dr. Dan Siegel, Siegel, I think it is. He has a concept called the Healthy Mind Platter, and there's about 7 different concepts in there. It's very similar to the sort of work I do, but it's an easy one for people to look up if they wanted to have a look at a number of different areas in their lives that they can pay some attention to and give a little bit of focus on. So that sets up the foundation for somebody to be the best version of themselves that they can be. In terms of an organization, I think have the honest conversation with people in there to say, are we ready for this? And there's a tendency in smaller organizations to say, oh no, we don't have any problems at all. We're fine. That's a red flag to me. I mean, just looking at the stats, there's no reason to think that you're immune to it. And in fact, in other ways, a company that says, oh, we're like family here. Just about every family I've ever spoken to where there's been a suicide in the family, they said, we didn't see it coming. We had no idea. Yeah. We thought he or she was fine. You know what I mean? So in fact, the closer that the people are in a business, sometimes the less likely they are to share it. Somebody called Haley in the chat there saying, how have you convinced male senior leaders to be more vulnerable? It really is a conversation. It's just got to start with, look, this is where we're at. And someone put their hand up and said, I have struggled in the past, or my partner has. And just to start to have the conversation. But it also, like we said earlier on, there's needing to know what to look for and needing to know what to say when you see it. It's a skill set every leader and every manager should have. And there is training out there in doing it. And I do a lot of that as well. We call it empathy by stealth. So we train leaders to become empathetic by dealing with it as if it's a management skill set they should have. They call them soft skills a lot of the time. They're not, they're essential. So for the individual, work on being the best version of yourself you can by being resilient. For an organization, just, you got to start with the conversation and then go from there and reach out and get some help around it. Prevention is the key. That's really it. That's where we're at.
Yeah, good stuff. Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks for your time and sharing your expertise with us. It's certainly a big issue, and as I've been saying for a while, you know, resilience in this territory of having the skill and capability to deal with mental health issues as they arise is another one where, you know, it's actually a skill set that you need to develop in advance of needing it. Sometimes we don't have that luxury, and, you know, it'll be, I think, really key over the next few weeks as workplaces start to head back. Spending a little bit of time in review and reflection, and kind of easing into it, not rushing too hard.
Yeah.
There'll be the temptation, I think, to just snap back to the way things were.
Yeah.
And
that will be the knee jerk. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's a bit of dangerous territory. It'd be much better to kind of sneak in a little bit and just be mindful of some of these issues around us and keep an eye and an ear out for ourselves and for each other.
Yeah, it's going to simmer. You know, it's not going to be a slap in the face necessarily. It will for some, but it starts with a conversation, and it starts with just genuineness, openness, and vulnerability, really.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks very much, Mark. One of the things I've greatly appreciated about the conversation, and I think it speaks a bit to what Hayley was asking there, is that, you know, these conversations are often very capably driven by some passionate women with great skill sets, and I think we need to get more blokes into that mix, talking openly about mental health and the skill sets to listen empathetically and offer something of value to people when they're sharing their vulnerability. So thanks for your part in that. It makes our community a better and safer place to be.
And to Hayley, if you need support in doing that, dress it up as a skill set. You know, if blokes think that they're solving something, we're much more inclined to embrace it. Sad but true. There you go.
Good stuff. Thanks very much, Mark.
Much indeed. Thank you.
So that's a wrap. We'll see you same time, 2 p.m. Perth time, for our topic next week. We're going to be talking with Grant Axe Rawlinson, who's a human-powered adventurer based up in Singapore but born in New Zealand. He's climbed mountains, rode across oceans, run across continents, cycled across continents, and we're going to be talking about resilience and what do you do in those moments where all seems lost and as if there's just no way you're going to get to where you want to go to. So I look forward to seeing you possibly in that conversation next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers, Mike.